Lord, thank you for this time together. Thank you for all who are able to be here this evening and those who will hear this message and this word from Karen. Thank you for Karen and her working this conversation into her calendar, dear Lord. Dear Lord, allow us to hear with ears to hear and minds to receive and hearts to be open to what you are saying in our lives, dear Lord. Thank you again for this time together. In your Son's precious name and through the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Our special guest today is Dr. Karen Benjamin, who teaches history at Elmhurst University in Illinois. She teaches a wide range of topics, particularly about American history. She is the recipient of the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And this past summer, she published the book entitled Good Parents, Better Homes and Great Schools, Selling Segregation Before the New Deal. And in that book, she identifies certain cities within the New South, including Winston-Salem. And so, without any further ado, we want to welcome our very special guest, Dr. Karen Benjamin.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this evening. I know how precious that time is, particularly during this season. I will be honest, I've been working on that book for over 15 years. I wrote the proposal for the grant when I was at home on unpaid maternity leave with my youngest child, my other child. I kid around with her that this book is her twin. And sometimes, I wondered if it was worth the sacrifice, especially that my kids made, or my spouse made, or my parents, my sister, the missed vacations, etc. And but when I see interest, particularly in local communities, and particularly in terms of the future and what this evidence means and how it can be used to help achieve justice. And I don't think you can do that without first looking back and finding out how we got here. And that means the world, and it makes every single moment, worth it. And so thank you. And I hope you do find some of this useful. And I would suggest, a lot of the details are in the book. So if, there was a story or something like that you wanted to use, let me know, and I can help you find the elaboration on it in the book if that's helpful. So my connection to North Carolina, my parents live in Wilmington. My grandparents lived in Wilmington. I have an uncle and aunt and their children and grandchildren who all live in Wilmington. And so I was visiting my grandparents in North Carolina since I was little. And in my dissertation, Raleigh was one of the cities that I was researching. And I was looking at a collection of letters and papers of a Black principal in Raleigh. And he had spent 20 years trying to get a new school for his community by St. Augustine's College, which is where he lived. And every time there was a bond issue, he would be guaranteed that they would get a new school. And then he would help organize for the bond issue. The bonds would pass. And this is a story we see over and over and over again in lots of places. Then the school wouldn't be built. And I was actually looking for something else when I was reading this collection. And I came across this letter that had been written by his niece who lived in DC. And she said, "I'm so sorry about the disappointment about the school. They're just trying to get us all segregated." Um, and that just took me by surprise, right? Maybe surprise isn't the right word, but it really struck me as, even though it wasn't what I was researching, I knew it was important. Back in the day, you made a photocopy of something that you wanted to remember. And I made a photocopy of that and I kept that. And eventually I had the opportunity of going back to Raleigh, and I wanted to know what that letter was about and what was going on. And Sure enough, she was exactly right that there was an intentional effort to segregate Black families in the southeastern section of Raleigh, and they were used to do so. They were only opening new schools in the southeast section, and they were closing all the schools in other parts of the city. And so, regardless of need, at one point, the western part of Raleigh, there were more Black children going to school in the western part of Raleigh than the eastern part of Raleigh. And so, those of you, I'm sure all of you know Raleigh quite well. And can see how much that has changed. So I wrote that article about Raleigh, and then I wanted to see is something like this going on in other places. And so I looked at Atlanta and Houston and some other cities, and I came to Winston-Salem through that other research and actually through an article that I found in Raleigh. And that article was in the News and Observer, and it said, with a headline was something like, Winston-Salem solves the race problem or something like that, something ridiculous like that. And then it said the voluntary segregation program that was created by Mayor James Haynes, Haynes Underwear fame, has come up with a solution for what at the time was called, the race problem, or there are other names that it would be called too. And I thought that was interesting because I was looking at the connections between residential and school segregation, and here was in a very elaborate program intentional use of schools to create residential segregation. And so what I'd been looking at in Raleigh, I was looking more at impact. And here it just explained how it worked right out there. And so then I started looking at Winston-Salem and ultimately found that Winston-Salem, I could not have written this book without Winston-Salem because Winston-Salem is just so central and core to the narrative that I'm going to be explaining. The oldest race restriction and a deed that I found that wasn't invalidated by a local court soon after it had been imposed was actually in Winston-Salem. Now, that is a long project, to find race restrictions and deeds. You have to look county by county, deed by deed almost. And so lots of places are doing that. My understanding is there's a project here. I know there is one in Wake County, and I think there's one in Forsyth County too. We just have to be really careful that sometimes the end goal is to erase them. And I think that's the wrong thing to do because then we erase that history, right? We need that uncomfortable feeling of that these were created and that they shaped the cities and the nation that we live in now, and they still have an impact. They're not enforceable anymore, right? So, keeping them reminds us of that past. So Winston-Salem is enormously important. So I want to spend a little bit of time kind of explaining what was going on in Winston-Salem that I found and how that ties to my larger argument, if you will, in the book. And since we're on Zoom and it's a small group, I'm hoping that we can make this a little bit of a conversation. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions, provide your own insights whenever you feel comfortable doing so. But I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and I have a couple of slides for us to look at. But please, please, please join in whenever you want to do so. So can y'all see my screen? Hold on one second. Let me get this. Okay, so let me move that there. So I might need somebody so that I can see the slides. I might not be able to see you. Whoops, sorry. If you have a question. So if somebody could just, turn on your mic and let me know. So as Mark said, the title is Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools. And this kind of comes back to that myth. Computer's really sensitive right now. Sorry about that. I want to be able to see y'all a little bit. Okay. So this comes from that myth that, especially with affluent white families, that a good parent should raise their children in a single family home in a neighborhood of only single family homes that are all within a similar price range, if you will, or value, and that their child should have access to a great school. And great schools have always been defined, then and now in relative terms, which means better than what other children have access to, including schools that other children are required to attend by law in some cases. So I know the structure in North Carolina is a little bit different. I'll come back to that. But this idea of upward mobility, and you want to put all your time and energy and resources into your children so that they have opportunities and that those opportunities become competitive. So it's not just you want to do your best for your kids, but that's a relative thing. And so sometimes, right, that desire to do something for your kids comes at the cost of someone else's child. And that you may or may not even be aware that somebody else's child does not have opportunities or is facing greater harm in order for you to have more resources for your own kids. So, kind of my end message for those of you who have to leave early is that, of course, we love our children and we care about our children and we want the best for them. But can we care about all children and not just our own? And understanding the impact of what happens when we put our kids ahead of other kids in ways that actually decrease their opportunities. Was there anyone who had a question? I think I heard. Let me see if I can pull up the chat. So you're looking at the 1912 Sanborn map. These are the fire insurance maps, such a great resource because they have all the dwellings drawn, where they were on the lot, even. That's really helpful to kind of understand how cities develop over time. Really quickly, if you look at the map on the left over here, this is the old urban grid pattern that residential parks, suburban development will change. And so this grid pattern is created lot by lot, block by block. These are mixed use, mixed race, and mixed class neighborhoods. If you look at the map over here on the right, this comes from section 20. So here's Maple and East 4th Street. East 4th Street's important to the story of Winston-Salem and segregation, but you can kind of see here that you have a variety of uses. Here's Reynolds tobacco shed. This is a store. Here's a row of, of middle. I'm so sorry, that is, for some reason, this is really sensitive. A row of middle class homes. And then if I'm worried when I move my mouse, it shames this. Can you see the mouse? Is that not even worth it? Am I just messing things up for nothing? Or can you see where my cursor is? I'm sorry.
We can see where your cursor is.
Okay, good. Okay, because that's what keeps bumping me out of my slideshow. So here, thank you for that. You can see these smaller dwellings, kind of duplexes, and these would have been working class homes, maybe even for people working over here. So you have a variety of uses, a variety of classes. A lot of you may know that you had block by block development, and so you had mixed race neighborhoods too. So you might have a row of houses with white single family homes, and then around the corner on the cross street, you might have a row of black single family homes, right? And so that didn't cause any problems for the tenets of white supremacy that white folks were trying to uphold, as long as dressed and who have better manners and who are very attractive, because those children of the Black doctor, your children might fall in love with them, right? And so that is the protection of white supremacy, is making sure that that white women don't fall in love, right, with a black man, and then have children, and that puts all of kind of white supremacy in the racial hierarchy. So, I know you know that already, but kind of the core of what's going on here and what they're trying to protect, right? So over here is the first residential park in Winston-Salem, West End, which I know you're all familiar with. I know it's hard to imagine West End is on the outskirts of town now, but certainly when it was established and created in 1892-ish, it was on the outskirts of town. And you can already see how these residential parks are changing development from the area, right? So they have the curvilinear streets. They don't fit into the urban grid. This is a large piece of property that's going to be developed in a homogeneous way, all single family homes. You're not going to have multifamily housing. You're not going to have stores. And people were used to living in communities where they lived close to work and their churches and their cultural institutions and their friends and their families and their shopping. And now you're kind of asking them to move out to the outskirts of town where none of that exists and then have to commute back. And so they needed to kind of create a means to draw people out to those residential lots from their old traditional neighborhoods that they liked. And one of the ways they did that is by saying that these new neighborhoods are good for your children, that it is worth the sacrifice of commuting because you're doing something good for your children. Now, I've been told that Buena Vista is Buena Vista or Buena Vista, so I'm going to say Buena Vista in the presentation. So here you see kind of this image that this community offers home seekers the fullest advantages of city life with the dust, noise, and dangers, without the dust, noise, and dangers of downtown conditions. Sorry, that should say without. And the image, though, I think is really interesting here, is you can see a mom and her baby watching a little girl leave the gate by herself. So this idea that in an urban area, maybe you don't feel comfortable with that, but here in a residential park, that you can allow your children a little bit more freedom, that this is a better place for them to grow up. Central Terrace in South Winston-Salem, what used to be Salem, called Home Sweet Home. And here in the middle, the question says, have you provided a home for your own babies? And this whole paragraph is about how important it is to raise your kids in a single family home. It makes you a better parent, right? You're affectionate with your wife and babies. This is the father. It's not always the mother. You get down on the floor and romp and play with your boy and girl, and you sleep better that night. The memory of your old childhood home brings out lofty emotions in you, which you then, pass along to your children. So you start to see all of these child-centered ads in the early 20th century, and even earlier than that, in the late 19th century, where they're tying these new suburban communities to parenting. Do this for your kids. And you see this over and over again. I'm just using a couple of examples from Winston-Salem. Now, of course, if you want to sell your properties to parents, then you have to have a school, and not just any school, right? You have to have a better school or something that they don't have access to in their old neighborhoods. So Winston-Salem was such a young community, right? Really starts to grow after Reynolds Tobacco Company is established in 1876. So you've got fewer than 500 people in 1870. By 1890, you've got over 5,000. So 1892, when West End is created, the developers of West End also established the school system, the public school system in Winston-Salem. And they wanted to control where those original schools were located so that they could use them to sell their lots. And so here's West End. The one and only original white school is located right here at the entrance. And then the one and only black school is located over here on the other side of downtown, and there's a story behind the arguments about where the original black school should go to. And so I'm going to focus right now on the arguments of the developers of the residential parks for now, and I'll come back to that segregation piece later. Um, but here's an ad from 1892 that says, "This is worth thinking about. The schools will begin in a few days. Have you children to send? If so, are you convenient of the schoolhouse? If not, get yourself a lot near it," right? So that is very intentional and purposeful. And this is how you draw of the affluent white families that you want to live in that community out to that community. Here is another ad for Buena Vista. It is a natural instinct to want to provide a home. And here is a couple looking at a house, but this whole paragraph is about schools and the schools that those kids would be able to attend. It will be possible for your child to pass from the grammar grades all the way through the high school, never leaving home or having any great distance to travel until he or she is ready for college. And this isn't just about convenience, right? This is about exclusion, because what they're saying is that your children will attend schools only with those kids that also live in this community. So the idea is that one of the things that we're selling that will make you a better parent and give your kids special opportunities is that this is going to be an exclusive neighborhood. And because the schools are tied to the residential parks, that means that the same kids will be at the school as will be in the residential park. And this is about class segregation. So even in a school system, like you would find in North Carolina, where black and white schools are segregated, you're also going to see schools becoming segregated by class. And this is true for both white schools and black schools. Not all white schools are equal, and not all black schools are equal. If they were, then they would not create residential segregation in the way that they did. Once again, only a better school is going to draw people out into a certain neighborhood. And that's really kind of core to what's going on. Let me take a quick pause and just see if so I can't see y'all when I am looking at my slides. Are there any questions or comments or anything? Let me see where y'all are. Y'all are way back here. How are we doing? We good? All right. Sorry, that's the problem with Zoom is I can't read the room while I'm presenting. All right, back we go. So the first buyers, though, for a residential park, they're not the families that ultimately, right, will be the ones who build the homes. Instead, there's speculators, and they need speculators to buy these lots because they got to raise cash. First of all, they have to pay for the larger pieces of property that they're now developing. Remember, the urban lots are developed kind of lot by lot. You buy a lot and then you decide what to do with it, build a home, build a store. And then as the city grows out around you, then you might be able to sell that piece of property for a nice profit, especially if it's wanted for commercial or industrial use. So this is a much larger investment. Plus, if you want people to move out there, you've got to provide, pavement, sidewalks, you've got to pave the roads, you've got to extend water and sewerage, and all of these other conveniences. You might need to add some park space, etc. And all that was really expensive. And so they sold the first lot to speculators to raise that cash. Now, this is where the deed restrictions come in. Why do they want deed restrictions? Well, if you're eventually going to sell these lots to families with children as something different than an urban area, something where the kids are protected from things like, a store being on the same block, that these are all single family houses, then you've got to make sure that these speculators don't do something to kind of ruin that portrayal of this future neighborhood that doesn't actually yet exist. And they found that deed restrictions were the best way to do that. Now, of course, the problem is that Americans don't like to be told what to do, and they certainly don't like to be told what to do with their own property, right? It is my property. I bought it. I have constitutional protections that I can do whatever I want with my own property. And deed restrictions are saying, no, you can't, right? You can't do all of these things, which traditionally would have led to a nice profit, like commercial properties are worth more than a single family house. A multifamily dwelling, right, will produce more income than a single family house, etc. And so they had to make the case that these deed restrictions, once again, were not only something that they should accept, but that they should pay a premium for. And so you see the same kind of argument, child-centered argument for the deed restrictions. This example is from Cameron Park in Raleigh, which is now Forest Park. We can talk about that. No one who appreciates the influence of environment on the child life will build his home in a community where conditions are uncertain. For the above reason, it has been thought best to place such restrictions on the property as will properly safeguard the interest of those who have been good enough to make their homes in Cameron Park. So the influence of environment on the child life, once again, just like those ads, all of this is very, very child-centered, and that this is why you need to have those restrictions, because it's better for children. And then that's where the property value will come in, because it will be in demand by families with young children. Now, deed restrictions are going to lead to the first race restrictions or racial covenants. And like I said at the beginning, the oldest one that I found was actually in Forsyth County in Winston-Salem. Now, the 14th Amendment says that you cannot take away someone's constitutional rights based on race. And one of those core constitutional rights is the right to own property, to use it as you see fit, and to profit off of it. And so a lot of developers, it's not that only developers in the South or local officials in the South are interested in residential segregation. You see that throughout the country. The difference is that a lot of developers were worried that if they imposed something that was clearly unconstitutional, and they knew that it was because all their lawyers said you can't do this, that this all of a sudden would put all of their deed restrictions in jeopardy, and they didn't want to do that. Now, the first post 14th Amendment race restriction actually was in Ventura, California, targeting Chinese residents in that community. But that was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Circuit Court for that region 6 years after it was first imposed. Now, during that time period, a man named Henry Starbuck, I wish I was in the room with you so I could see your faces a little bit better. And I don't know if you're familiar with the name Starbuck, but apparently Henry Starbuck's dad owned most of East Winston at one time. They had a huge amount of property. During that space of time, before that first deed race restriction was declared unconstitutional, he started imposing race restrictions on some of his property in East Winston, 3 properties in particular. And like I said, those are the oldest ones that I found. Now, why Winston-Salem? I mean, if you look at this chart here, this kind of helps explain what's going on in the South. I'm using Chicago as a comparison. But, if you look at Atlanta and Raleigh and Winston-Salem in 1900, about 40% of the total population was made up of Black residents, fewer than 2% in Chicago. I told you how much Winston-Salem grew between 1870 and 1890. Well, the percentage of the population made up of Black residents went from about 21% in 1870 to almost 60% in 1890. So when that race restriction was imposed in 1889, this is an effort to preserve block level segregation, to control who moves next door to you in a city in which the Black population is growing faster than the white population because R.J. Reynolds, which opened in 1875, is recruiting Black workers. And so you see the effort and the willing to take risks with race restrictions begin in southern cities. Um, Racial covenants, which means a race restriction imposed on every property, like in West End, that will become the norm in Winston-Salem in the 1890s. It will become the norm in most southern cities in the first decade of the 20th century. It will not become the norm, and that includes border cities too, like Kansas City and Baltimore. It won't become the norm beyond that until after the great exodus from the South, the Great Migration during World War I. And so, as you can see with Chicago, you start to see the Black population in northern cities expand, and then these northern cities are going to start imposing the same kinds of restrictions. They would wanted to impose other restrictions that we'll talk about, but they were already declared unconstitutional at that time. Does that make sense? Um, so, and please interrupt me if you have any questions or comment or if there's any problems. Now, when Winston-Salem's first, so Winston and Salem aren't combined yet, right? That'll take place later. And so I was really describing Winston, and the first school district of Winston-Salem is older. But but they're already thinking about these two kind of sister cities together because they're already thinking about sorting people by race and class in the 1890s. So the West End would be the most prestigious area. The eastern part of Winston would become more lower middle class, right? Clerks and shop owners. North would be more industrial. South in Salem would be more middle class, solidly middle class. And so in those four directions, you see racial covenants used in East Winston, in Salem to the south, and in West End in the 1890s. The only place that didn't have them would have been in kind of the industrial north side. That same time, a residential park opens in the southeastern part of the metropolitan area called Columbia Heights. Are y'all familiar with Columbia Heights? I'm sure you are. Um, this dates back to 1892. This is the plat map for Columbia Heights, and this was a residential park developed for Black families. It was kind of the dream of Simon Atkins to create kind of this ideal community for Black families to raise their children, right? That desire for better homes and great schools, right? That extends to all families, not just affluent white ones, but they're the ones the advertising is targeting. So this community is invested in by the same people who are creating residential parks, white residential parks with race restrictions in other parts of the city. And indeed, Ludlow is the engineer who plats this. He's the same person platting like West End and these other residential parks. So, this idea that we're going to create residential segregation, but there's some level of equality here. But if you look at this map here, back to the sandboard map, you can immediately see that there is no equality here. And remember, this is 1892 that they begin platting Columbia Heights and selling lots, and those lots in Columbia Heights were worth more than the lots in either the northern part of Winston or eastern Winston.
So Karen,
yes.
And 1892 is the same year that Slater Normal School, which is now Winston-Salem State, was established.
Yes, absolutely. And so Columbia, thank you for adding that. So Columbia Heights is is adjacent to that normal school. And that's terrific for the folks who are working at the normal school or who are attending the normal school to have that community. But the problem is for other families who are working downtown or whose kids go to Depot Street School, the school that I pointed out on the other map, look at the location. I mean, do you see any problems here with where Columbia Heights is relative to the rest of Winston-Salem? The streets aren't connected. Right here, you're off the grid, but the streets are all connected to the grid. Here, they're not connected, and it's completely isolated by railroad tracks. There was only one exit from the community at the time. It was across an at grade railroad crossing. This is a picture from from Atlanta, that the Urban League took, but you get the idea, right, of children having to cross at grade tracks on their way to school. It was very dangerous. Depot Street School was the only school in Winston-Salem that had classes offered above fourth grade level. So if you wanted your child to have access to a high school curriculum, they needed to go to Depot Street School. This is a very small town, as we talked about, but it took 30 minutes to get from Columbia Heights into the city. And families just weren't willing to. That is a whole different level of sacrifice, especially considering the fact that that sewerage is not extended into the community, that water is not, so they're using wells, they still have outhouses. So a lot of middle class, affluent Black families, particularly those associated with the Forsyth Savings and Trust Company, which was a Black-owned bank in the early 20th century, they had resources and they wanted to live near their bank and their other businesses and the Depot Street School. They also wanted to live on paved streets and have running water inside their houses and have access to electricity and all of these modern conveniences. And so even though they purchased lots in Columbia Heights, they began purchasing homes in East Winston. And so that neighborhood that I showed you before at the beginning is really important, because over time, this row of housing that I showed you before, various Black businessmen are going to start to buy properties there, including a Black dentist and including a man named James Timlick, who owned a blacksmith shop on 4th Street, further west, which would have been closer to downtown. And he owned a property in Columbia Heights, but he moved his family into this residence here where his children could go to the Depot Street School, where he was convenient to work, and all of the other resources that they needed. Now, the neighbor next door, and the white, so there are already other Black residents on the street before the Timlicks moved in, but not in this house right here. And so one of the former owners of this property claimed that there was a race restriction on this piece of property, and so that Timlick could not move into this house. The Timlicks could not move into this house. Now, Starbuck originally owned, right, this larger lot here, and then eventually it would get subdivided. You can see that the thing about a residential park that might be nice is all the lots are the same size. They all have street access. Whereas an urban street, right, people are just kind of subdividing willy-nilly. This piece of property doesn't even have street access. But Starbuck owned this piece of property, and this was one of the properties that he originally had a race restriction on. But over time, that property changed hands something like 8 times, and it had a large number of renters too. And a woman who bought that property and subdivided it, once she started subdividing it, she no longer, they had new deeds and the race restriction fell out. Starbuck no longer cared about that piece of property. He'd kind of moved on. It looks like maybe his family wanted to use this property, which is why they put that race restriction on. Anyway, so they challenged that with that there was a race restriction on there. That argument fell apart immediately. So then the white families on East 4th Street demanded a segregation ordinance. So in 1912, Winston-Salem gets its first segregation ordinance following the lead of Baltimore. Atlanta will create its first segregation ordinance at that time too. And the argument was that a segregation ordinance would prevent miscegenation and, blah, 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 blah. The problem with that is that there were already all of these mixed race blocks. And so it was very hard to make that case in court. And very soon, the North Carolina Supreme Court is going to declare that law unconstitutional, and then the U.S. Supreme Court would in Buchanan v. Worley. That story is actually a lot more interesting and more complex, but I'm looking at the time, and so I'm going to end there with that story. And just one more thing, really quickly. So. The segregation ordinances were an effort by lower income whites and also, those folks who couldn't afford to move into a residential park or didn't want to move into it to preserve block level segregation. The elites didn't care. They were like, move out of your neighborhood and then allow Black families to buy those homes because they're going to pay way more for them than a white family would be willing to do so because that demand has already fallen. Not because it's a mixed race neighborhood, but because urban neighborhoods are no longer seen as appropriate places to raise children because of all these ads. So then the next thing that happens is James Haynes comes in here and says, I have a solution. And that solution is we'll use schools to draw people out into certain areas of the city. And so we'll create a school, here in the northern section, and then East Winston will have a white school, and then the south side will have a white school, and then the west side will have a white school, and then the Black schools will be in these corners. Right. And the idea was that if you provide really expensive schools, Winston-Salem had enormous school lots, and they were kind of parks and school lots combined, that if you did this would draw families out to the schools, and that would create segregation on its own. And it would keep people there. And then it followed through with a racial zoning scheme that kind of followed the boundaries of those schools. And indeed, that strategy worked so well that even after segregation ordinances are declared unconstitutional, racial zoning is declared unconstitutional, even after people say they don't support segregation, it continues to maintain residential segregation. That connection between residential segregation and school segregation continues to the present. And with states like North Carolina passing laws in which private schools, right, private school tuition can be paid through public tax money, it feels like we're moving in the wrong direction. So I'm going to leave it at that and see if you have any questions. Thank you so much for listening to all of that.
Thank you, Karen, for all that. One thing that struck me is I grew up in Charlotte, and actually I grew up in Charlotte during the height of the busing. My mother actually worked for the school board to help with the busing throughout the city and develop a plan as to how this would work, and how we would bus people around and our children around and from different areas. And I haven't lived in Charlotte for quite some time, but it's my understanding that that things have reverted back to, well, why are we busing our children, all the way over here to go to school, when we have a perfectly good school right here and we could just stay here and we could just grow up with our people here, whatever our people is, our people right here. And it just seems like, every step forward is three steps backward, because we always find a way to kind of segregate ourselves, it seems like.
Yeah, I think that's a really important, and I guess that's my major takeaway, kind of I'm pleading, is that North Carolina, because it had countywide school systems, that allowed it to push back against segregation in ways that, places like Chicago that has all of these borders and boundaries drawn in that were established by the state, but people swear were created by God and cannot be changed. And the Supreme Court said, right, you cannot cross these boundaries. Children and money cannot cross these boundaries. And so North Carolina didn't have that. Um, but the problem is that Black children bore almost the entire brunt of busing. White children were declared gifted, right? And that was the draw to get them to leave their neighborhoods to go to school. But Black children often spent an hour on those buses. And then once charter schools came into play, that whole idea of busing so that all of the schools have about, an equal number, none of them are more than a third of the children qualify for a free or reduced lunch, right? So to not have any high poverty schools, that started falling apart, and charter schools kind of destroyed that. And so if you look at Wake County in particular, that received a lot of praise for doing this well, there are lots and lots and lots of schools that are almost 100% of the children now are on free or reduced lunch, and then other schools where almost none of them are. And then now with private schools, right? So people will find a way to put that burden on somebody else. And here I'm talking about, these same affluent white families. The burden is on someone else. They'll have special privileges or resources for their children in order to promote integration, or they'll just, find ways to get around it all together through charter schools, or now sending their kids through private schools. So I really think we have to get to the heart of what's going on, which is this idea that affluent white parents believe that they're doing something that's good for their own children without understanding the larger harm that is done. Certainly more of that harm is falling on some children, right, than other children. But we could list all, if we had time, I could list all kinds of problems that we create for our society that will come back, right, and create harm for all of us. I mean, we all have a stake in understanding that trying to preserve those privileges for our children is not creating a better future for them. And I can tell you right now, as a teacher and as a parent, young people are really worried. Like, we are handing off a society that they don't want to inherit. And they are very aware of all the problems that we have not addressed or solved or seem to care about. And that is their problem. They can't afford health care, right? They can't afford education. They can't afford housing. So I think that we can do a better job and creating this hyper competitive society, right, in which we have growing and growing and growing income inequality. So only the very, very few have any rewards, and the stakes for everybody else is just is just if your children fall at all, right, it's a complete disaster. So I'm trying not to go on for too long. But I'm just really passionate about this because I do think the interest convergence is there if we would talk about it. And I don't want the burden to be on Black children. I don't blame people for saying we're done with this. But I do think that affluent white parents, and I'm talking about liberals, who talk the talk but don't walk the walk, I think we've got to start understanding the harm that we're creating for other people's children, but that ultimately creates a society that doesn't work for almost anyone.
So I have a question. So I would love your thoughts on how do you see the church, the larger church, what's the response you think?
I mean, I love the response from churches here this evening. When I came and spoke in Winston-Salem in August, I spoke in a church as well. And when I was writing the book, I wasn't thinking about that, but I'm really excited about the leadership role that churches can play to really hold the mirror. And here I'm talking especially to white folks, and I'm talking to white folks um, because they're the ones who are engaging in opportunity hoarding, um, and hold that mirror up to them. And then the second step, right, is that we've got to promote um, conversations across race and class about what is going on and what the problems are of the city. And we've got to know each other and care about each other. And I know that Winston-Salem has done a good job of starting having those conversations. In Chicago, I have a dear friend who founded the Bronzeville Historical Society, and she grew up in Inglewood. I don't know if y'all know Chicago very well, but Inglewood is has always been kind of this notorious neighborhood um, that a lot of students had never been in. And I'm talking about a lot of Black students as well that live in the suburbs, had never been there. And so Sherry and I, we had students go to Inglewood and create a park, right? And work with community members in that park, including Sherry's family, and um, and build community, right? And share a meal and understand that that Inglewood is not this place you read about in the press, but this is a place with wonderful people, and those and that you can reach out across the city, and the city can be your community and not just your little portion of the world, I guess is what I would say. And I think churches can play a very important role in that. Any other questions? And I understand, and I it's so hard because there's so much that I want to say, and just picking a few minor stories to tell. But I also know that y'all live in Winston-Salem and are in the surrounding area, and you know this history in these places way better than I do. So please feel free to correct me if I like mispronounced a place, or I did not mention something that was important, or someone that was important that should be acknowledged. I would appreciate that.
I was happy to hear you talk about why the Black population grew so fast here. And my grandparents both worked for R.J. Reynolds, and they came to Winston-Salem because some other relative came back and got them. And it's more of free labor, pretty much, to help grow a very booming population and a booming business, but it was more free labor. But we repeated that for the people we're trying to put out now too, because we brought them here and now we don't need them. So let's do something different.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. And I think I'm so glad that you raised that too, and the amount that people were paid, also the amount that domestics were paid, and other people were paid for the hard labor that exposed them to all kinds of environmental harms, right? The environmental harms that are dumped on certain communities. I teach environmental history, and that's one of the messages I was trying to get my students to understand is that we don't solve our environmental problems, right? This is another thing that the churches can do. And the young people are really scared about this because it's so easy to create sacrifice zones and dump the pollution on somebody else, our immigrant communities, our Black communities, our Indigenous communities, and but ultimately that pollution and climate change will have an impact on all of us. So instead of trying to find new technologies that move us away from fossil fuels, et cetera, we just dump the toxic waste on other communities. So that's another way that segregation um, creates harm. So I'm thinking about, Deborah, what you said, about these families that made so little and then had all kind were exposed to all kinds of environmental harm at work and at home. That's part of that piece too.
Yeah, we smell tobacco all day. I mean, as a kid, we smelled tobacco all day. Um, to the point now I can't really stand smoke, but at that point, everybody was smoking because we all had the tobacco smell that was coming. But even more recently, we had a concrete factory
Yeah.
that exploded in no fertilizer company, Weaver Fertilizer,
God, even
in an
worse.
African American neighborhood, and just the effects of that. If, when you look at those companies who do those kinds of work, they're not in Buena Vista.
No, and I'm afraid we're gonna see more of that with those data centers for the AI. That's gonna be a real problem too, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Um,
For sure. And we don't stop and ask those questions, right? And certainly there's a disparate impact, which is why we don't ask those questions. When everybody lived in closer proximity, there was concern, right? That harm would have an impact on everybody, the concrete plant, right? Or the fertilizer plant. But if you can move to the other side of town and separate yourself from that, then there's less interest in cleaning it up for everybody or finding, technologies that would provide cleaner energy, et cetera, moving away from, I mean, don't get me started on fertilizer. That's a whole other, issue that we could talk about is mistakes we've made with fertilizer and agriculture um, but other thoughts.
So I'm thinking about those real estate developers who came up with this marketing campaign and how they were able to kind of tap into something about the human condition, especially for people of privilege. And that might be one of the points of intersection, I think, for churches is how can we identify and address the human condition? What do people want? And how can we expose desires that are misshaped, desires that are biased, that are prejudiced, that are selfish? I think that's one of the things that we can try to carry forward.
Absolutely. And the first chapter of the book really kind of looks at kind of this intensive parenting that the developers are tapping into that already exists. But if you look at the progressive era, um, mothers were trying to clean up cities, right? They were trying to pass laws for, the Pure Food and Drug Act. I mean, they're thinking about things more citywide. And then once people start moving into these residential parks, then the message is that all you have to do is take care of your own family. And, excuse my language, but like, to hell with everybody else was really the attitude, right? That families became very insular. You take care of your nuclear family, and that is your job. And that's a pretty big change from just a few decades before when you have the neighborhood union in Atlanta, right? Where you have these Black women who are working so hard to provide better communities across the city. They're not just working with their own children. And you have similar types of, I mean, they were segregated, don't get me wrong, right? We can criticize them all day, but there was in these, more mixed use, mixed race, mixed class neighborhoods, there was a concern for the larger community and not just my block and my family, my school. And I think you're absolutely right that churches can play a role in having people start to think outwardly a little bit more, not as charity, right? Or not because you're a good person, but because, um, it's about justice, but it's also the interest convergence piece. Derek Bell's a genius, right? Like he's absolutely right that the only time we do have true movement is when you see that interest convergence, that it's it's in your family's interest as well as everyone else's.
Something that also struck me was this idea about segregation, and segregation wasn't equally distributed. I mean, we weren't segregating. You mentioned how they were trying to segregate various parts of the city into various kind of classes, but even those were disproportionate in how services were rendered. I know I don't know the story, but I'm aware of the story of how, Highway 52 basically the um, cut the community, a thriving community that was probably segregated in a sense, or maybe not even in a sense, in a reality, but it cut a thriving community and, forced it to become disjointed and disconnected, and therefore losing more of the social structure that they had already tried to facilitate within that community.
Yeah, and that's nationwide, right? That's everywhere. That's Chicago, that's Houston where I grew up. That's everywhere. It's these highways intentionally either took out the last remaining mixed race neighborhoods, or they went right through the middle of Black neighborhoods. They took out housing, like in Chicago, I-90 takes out housing, Black businesses, Black churches, Black schools. And a lot of the people who were displaced moved into public housing because there were no other options at that time during the post-war period. So yeah, 100%. And that was intentional too.
And I just heard a story about New York City Central Park. Central Park was once a thriving African American community until, the white they were going to put a park in the white neighborhood, but the white neighborhood said no, we're not going to have this. And the black neighborhood used the same laws that the white neighborhood used to thwart it, but it was disregarded in the black neighborhoods, and that just uh, obliterated the entire African American community there. And Central Park landed basically on top of the African American community.
Yeah, it's a really old story. I also want to make it clear that when we talk about like Black communities and white communities, or Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the scale was so different. So now that could be miles and miles and miles of segregation. Whereas in the early 20th century, particularly in the South, and in the 19th century, that could just be a block or half a block, right? Like when people talked about a Black district, it could be half a block. And so yes, a long history of when we want to provide a resource, and usually that resource was enjoyed more by affluent white families. The expense, right, would come at communities of color, families of color, and certainly communities that don't have the same sorts of resources. And going back to the beginning of our history. That's a great point.
So now we see gentrification coming back and whites moving back into the downtown area, pushing blacks still further away from what was central now, and creating laws and legislation which negatively impacts the people who now may be homeless or have some other issues because of some of the pieces that have already happened.
100%. And then when people get displaced away from further away from downtown, then they're easier to ignore too, right? Because they're further from the view of the more affluent areas of the city. We see the same thing in Chicago and lots of other places. I know that the same thing's happening in Raleigh, and in some cases, right, you can see that happening with schools. You provide schools once again in those areas, and then you draw people back into them. But if people aren't concerned about about that impact, then all they're doing is repeating the displacement that we've seen over and over again. I mean, if you think about the original residential parks that I was talking about, a lot of those, especially in Wake County, those were built. That's why Cameron Park was renamed Forest Park, because a lot of those residential parks were built on what had recently been plantations. And so, thinking about who's being displaced from that area, the Camerons were slaveholders, then you have sharecroppers. And so we're going to distance ourselves from that history by changing the name. I get it. But at the same time, we're trying to forget about the past and not actually deal with it on some level. And so I agree with you that gentrification is not solving the problem. It's actually it's making it worse in some cases, as when people are displaced and you don't have laws that are meant to protect them.
Part of the displacement, I know, sometimes leads to people not getting a fair value for their home.
Absolutely.
And so, whereas most white people will be able to sell their home for a profit, and that could provide generational wealth in neighborhoods where gentrification is happening, then those families, oftentimes African American families, they're literally losing value because of what's being forced.
Yep. And our dual real estate market, right?
Yeah.
So white properties go up in value and Black properties go down in value. And yeah, like it's just pure exploitation as a land grab. Once again, this is just a new land grab with a new type of development. And there is no benefit for the the residents who had created communities there. 100%.
So, as one who's pastoring of a community who has no walls, we've had to get out in the community, and that's where you hear a lot of these stories. And so, maybe that's an answer to my own question earlier. What do churches do about this? Maybe we get out into our communities. Mark, you're smiling. So, John Wesley did that, right? So,
And
yeah. So,
read, nobody has time to read anymore, but like it is so important because that's where the evidence is and that's where the information is and that's where the understanding is. And your gut tells you one thing, but unless you have the evidence to go before city council or the school board or your community or your church, then you're not going to be able to make that case. And so, just encourage people to read. It would be terrific. I don't know. I don't think my book is actually in the Forsyth County Library, but I would love, for it to be available for people to, even if they don't read the whole thing, at least to kind of look at the parts about Winston-Salem, so they have a sense of how the city developed and why it looks the way that it does, and that impact. I think that education piece is so important. And that first step of making sure you understand what's going on.
mhm.
Well, we can fix the matter about the book being in the library.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking not just in one particular library, but in like the King Public Library, which is literally a half a mile from the parsonage. Um, you know, we could do that. That's an easy fix.
And just there are so many, and not just my book.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
there's so many just really great books. I mean, the ones on Winston-Salem, I think, are especially important because then that's the evidence, like you said, when you go before city council and the school board. But so many terrific books, right? That members of the church can do book clubs and things like that, where they're reading together and kind of thinking about various issues. Um, and issues that are affecting the immigrant community too, which I know in Chicago, right? Like, we've been, and I teach at a Hispanic serving institution. So we have been dealing with ICE raids and families that are really afraid, and I know that's happening in North Carolina now too. And so, yeah, just making sure that people are paying attention and we don't get so busy that we lose our own power, which is to know what's going on and what we should do about that locally. But I would hope that, please, and I mean this, like stay in touch with me. I would be more than happy if somebody wanted to go before the school board or the city council or, wanted to address zoning issues or something else, and you needed somebody to bring some historical evidence. I would be more than happy to do that. I know that some of those solutions need to come from within the community, but if anything in the book provides the evidence that you need to make the case, please let me know what I can do to help.
Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, this has been a real gift. Thank you for your time, Karen. Thank you for your scholarship and the deep impact that you are having on your students at Elmhurst and tonight with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And please share my email if anyone wants to get in touch with me. I appreciate you very much.